The shocking truth behind the war with China. The USA's desire for war with China is becoming more and more clear. Yet you might be surprised by the cause. In this video, we will be discussing why the US wants a war with China. Hence, the US dollar is the answer. Because of the dominance of the US dollar, the USA has developed into a very strong economic nation with a considerable military presence all over the world. Why is the USA willing to go to war for it? Let's start with a brief history of how the US dollar came to be so well known. Almost half of the world's productive capacity was under American control after World War II. Despite being devastated by the war, US allies were unable to cover the cost of US goods. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund were established by the United States to address this issue. The US dollar was subsequently recognized as the world's reserve currency. These two organizations were used to create a global financial framework that in turn gave the US a huge amount of power as the world's creditor, under the guise of multilateralism. This in turn established the US dollar as the global reserve currency. For the next few years, the US budget deficit grew, owing primarily to the large military spending used to crush countries across the world that were considered as impediments to US capital development and to international markets. Because of these massive budget deficits, gold began to flow back into Europe, and the US dissolved the link between gold and the US currency in 1971. At the time, no country was willing to call the United States bluff, because crashing the dollar would have been disastrous for export industries in surplus countries. During the same time, the United States pledged to militarily support Saudi Arabia and other OPEC countries in exchange for them pricing oil in US dollars, cementing the dollar's position as the world's main currency. As a result, countries such as Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom were forced to recycle their excess dollars back into the US by purchasing treasuries, further cementing the US dollar's position as the world's reserve currency. Dollar recycling enabled the Federal Reserve to keep interest rates low, incentivizing US investors to borrow more, which in turn enabled them to lend to developing countries in desperate need of finance, leveraging their near-monopoly position on lending. Because of the supremacy of the US dollar, the US has been able to keep the rest of the developing world obedient to them while draining most of their resources and returning nothing in return. So, what does any of this have to do with China? And why does the United States regard China as such a threat? As China expanded and its economy grew, so did its ability to lend to developing countries. However, China's loans to developing countries often came with better conditions and did not require those governments to undergo structural modifications, as did loans supplied by the World Bank or the IMF. This alternate credit source provides a path for these countries to thrive without having to be subordinate to or fearful of the United States. If emerging countries can achieve a basic degree of self-sufficiency and freely trade with other countries in their own currencies, the United States' supremacy will disappear, which is why China is viewed as such an existential danger to the United States, not because of its increasing military, or because it does not practice Western-style democracy, or even because the West believes it will invade Taiwan. It's all because China poses a challenge to the United States' currency dominance and financial monopoly. The US has been campaigning to isolate China for many years, with strong evidence of a Chinese-led economic alternative emerging roughly a decade ago. But recent developments have quickened the timescale for the risk of war. For starters, China's economy surpassed the United States in 2016, to become the world's largest when GDP is adjusted for purchasing power, and it will more likely overtake the United States in raw GDP terms sometime in the next decade, if not sooner. Second, China and Russia are becoming increasingly close, which the United States neither expected nor desired. Third, China's military is rapidly approaching parity with that of the United States. Given the massive defensive advantage China would have in repelling a US attack, forcing the US to expand its naval forces throughout the whole Pacific Ocean. Organizations and projects focused on industrialization and infrastructure investment, such as the 4th BRICS or BRICS, the SCO, and the BRI, are swiftly gaining support among emerging countries. The BRICS organization, which is an alliance of Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is particularly troubling to the United States. These countries' total population is 3.2 billion, accounting for 42% of the world's population, and they account for 30% of the world's economy. In addition, Argentina, Indonesia, Mexico, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Egypt, Nigeria, Sudan, and a number of other nations are lining up to join BRICS. A handful of these countries have already sought to join the organization, but BRICS has yet to publicly disclose the list of applicants or the admittance standards. The BRICS alliance has also established NDB, a new development bank headquartered in Shanghai, whose goal is to provide finance and resources for infrastructure and development projects in BRICS countries, other emerging economies, and developing countries, thus providing an alternative to the IMF and World Bank, which were previously the only viable options. Each of the BRICS founding members has equal shares and voting rights in the NDB, which is in stark contrast to the IMF and the World Bank, which are frequently criticized for disproportionately favoring developed countries, particularly the United States, giving them significant influence over policies and decision-making. Having the US dollar as the world's reserve currency has given the US significant leverage over other countries. The United States has not shied away from weaponizing the dollar, imposing dollar sanctions on Iran, Venezuela, Syria, and others. Nevertheless, with the commencement of the Russia-Ukraine war in 2022, the US illegally froze Russia's sovereign foreign reserves stored in US banks, taking dollar weaponization to a whole new level. This action by the United States was a step too far, and it not only violates international law and norms, as sovereign assets are supposed to be exempt from seizure or interference by other countries, but it also weakens trust and stability in the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. This has served as a wake-up call for several countries, which are now quickly evaluating their dollar holdings and looking for alternatives to the US dollar. In recent years, the Chinese yuan has increased its share of global trade. China has inked bilateral currency exchange agreements with 22 nations and created RMB clearance procedures in 8 as part of its Belt and Road Initiative. Settlements in Chinese RMB more than quadrupled in volume between January 21 and January 22 to become the fourth largest, accounting for 3.2% of global settlements. Although relatively tiny in comparison to US dollar settlement, the use of the yuan for international trade is fast increasing. China is currently doing significantly more trade with Russia, and a big percentage of that transaction will be settled in Chinese yuan. China is also in discussions with Saudi Arabia about breaking the petrodollar monopoly and pricing part of their oil contracts in RMB. It makes little sense for China, which is now Saudi Arabia's top oil buyer, to pay for that oil in US dollars. Now, returning to BRICS, it is widely speculated that the BRICS countries are working on developing a new reserve currency based on a basket of their own currencies in order to reduce their reliance on the US dollar. The consequences of the US dollar losing reserve currency status are unprecedented, which is why the US is employing every tool in their arsenal to keep China in check, and the sole reason they are willing to go to war with China. The United States' window of opportunity to impede China's growth is rapidly narrowing, if not already closed. But does this suggest that the US is indeed bracing for a military clash with China? That's all. Thank you for watching. Do not forget to like and subscribe to our channel and ring the bell icon to get more videos.